Till this hour, I was not acquainted with Brother Gors. I met him down here shortly just before time for us to begin our session. And I had just sort of randomly picked Richard Melson to lead us in a prayer and found out that these two men have an extended acquaintance with one another. I just couldn't get anybody else to lead the prayer, Richard. That's Brother Mike Gors grew up in Muncie, Indiana. He's married to Jessica. They have 3 children, Emma, Adam, and Seth. And he currently lives in Muncie, Indiana. He's the preacher at the elder. He's a preacher and an elder at the West Side Church of Christ in Yorktown, Indiana. He's a 1999 graduate of MSOP. He's serving in Fort Wayne, Indiana for 13 years now, and 7 years back at West Side, where he and Jessica were baptized 25 years ago. He's spoken on various lectures, held gospel meetings, and he's done mission work in Jamaica, Honduras, Tanzania, and India. I love the fact that he's gone to India. My heart is in India. But anyway, Mike is speaking on an unusual subject, and one that really interests me. God's having purity and mercy and extending our mercy. So we look forward to his lesson, and we invite you now to give attention to him. Brother Mike.
Thank you, brother. As the song goes, 20 years. Where'd they go? 20 years. I don't know. But 20 years has passed. We started in the Knight Arnold building, and we moved into this place. And I remember moving a lot of books from over there to over here. And that was something. There's a lot of people involved in these 20 years of my preaching. I don't remember who said this. I think Brother Bland said this once. You're a turtle on a fence post. That's me. There's a lot of people involved in my preaching. I love to preach. I love to teach. There's a lot of people who have been behind me and helping me and encouraging me, and I want to do this as long as I live. Having said that, I'm compelled to mention 2 very special people weighing on my mind that contributed greatly to my being a preacher. And one of them is Brother Herb Smith and his wife Betty. We lost Herb about a little over a year ago, and this past Monday we lost Betty. Matter of fact, when I'm done here, I have to go home to do her funeral. But I say this for this reason, is because back in April of 1996, I was wavering in my attendance at the West Side Church, and I got a call from an elder. That elder was Herb Smith, and he said, "Brother, I'm really concerned about you. I hate to see you give up on something that you just started. Would you please make a commitment to coming to this gospel meeting that we're having at the beginning of May?" I said, okay. Hung up the phone, as irritated as could be. Didn't realize what an elder's job was to do, and I thought, it's not his business what I'm doing. Anyway, huffing and puffing there, just to show up at this gospel meeting where Curtis A. Cates proceeded to step not only on my toes, but on my heart. And I remember the very last sermon on that last night, May 6th, 1996. He said, "You either need to get with it or get out." I don't think he said it in those ways. He probably did, but that night, he made me angry that night. I thought, who is he? But when I got over myself and was done being mad, I thought, you know what I do? I need to get with it. And a year later, I came here to the Memphis School of Preaching and began this journey of preaching. But it was because of an elder doing his work, going after those lost sheep, saying, you need to be here. So grateful to God for those people who have now gone on. Sometimes folks just get kind of lost in the credits because they go about their daily lives. But I'm grateful to God for those folks. In Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. The Lord had lodged his complaint against Israel. And as he always did, they always seem to lose their way. They seem to go off the rails and off into the wilderness so frequently. And he, out of his love, would send the prophets to speak to them, trying to bring them back. And he lodged his complaint through Micah. And once their conscience was pierced, they asked the question, beginning in verse 6, what does the Lord want from me? What does the Lord want from us? Maybe burnt offerings of calves a year old. Maybe 1,000 rams. 10,000 rivers of oil. I know, this will be it. How about my firstborn for my transgression and the sins of my soul? Maybe these grand things will appease God. God has been telling them all along, but they weren't listening. Maybe they had ears, but they weren't listening. He's even said in the text, the Lord has shown you, O man, what is good and what is required. Maybe you had eyes, but you couldn't see, and ears, but you didn't hear. He has shown you what is good. To do justly. To love mercy. To walk humbly with your God. This is what He wants. He wants you to do justly. He wants justice, not vengeance from you. He wants mercy, not ill will or being harsh and abrasive. And He wants you to walk humbly, not arrogantly, with the Lord. He doesn't want you to just merely extend mercy. He wants you to love mercy. To love mercy. I tell you, when I received this topic, my initial thought was, well, mercy is the withholding of judgment, the withholding of punishment that's legitimately due. And it is that, but it's so much more. So much more. To love mercy is to love benevolence. It is to love being a blessing. It is to love charity. It is to love goodwill. It is to love forgiveness. Forgiveness. To lift that debt that folks owe you. To lift that. Let's think about mercy for just a minute. Mercy, by definition, as a noun, is the outward manifestation of pity. It assumes need on the part of the one receiving it. Okay? That's just a definition. That's kind of boring. Let me say it this way. My son, my youngest son, he had a beach ball in the house. And his mother told him, you need to stop throwing that ball around the house. You're going to break something. She proceeded on about her day. I was standing upstairs and I was talking with her. And all of a sudden we heard this bang, crash. It was quiet for a minute. Then we see this head pop in the door. I don't think I should be on the Xbox for maybe about a month. The boy needed some mercy because his mama just told him, stop throwing that thing in the house. And not only did he just break something, but he broke something precious. He broke something of value. And so mercy was extended to him. He needed mercy. It is an outward manifestation of pity. It assumes need on the part of the one receiving it. We could say it this way. What does mercy look like when it's absent, when it's removed? Just think of Nadab and Abihu, who offered strange fire that the Lord commanded not. And they were immediately struck because of their sins and their disobedience. Think of Ananias and Sapphira. If we want to grade sins or put them on different levels, they lied and they lost their lives. They didn't receive mercy. It is, as a verb, signifies sympathy with the misery of another person. You see it. You see the misery of someone else, and it's then accompanied, because it's a verb, it's accompanied by this act of kindness. It's an act of pity and compassion. Do something for them. You reach out to them. You help them. And it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter their color or their race or religion. It doesn't matter their gender. You reach out to them because they're made in the image of God and they need help. It is how God describes himself when he called on Moses to get the second tablets and carve them out himself. As he was talking to him and meeting with Moses, he said in Psalm 34 and verse 6, the Lord God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, and abounding in goodness and truth. But it's how he described himself, filled with mercy. Think about the reason he had to have those second tablets. He had Moses make them because of the disobedience of Israel. It's understood as precious. If you look at Psalm 36, verses 5 through 7, the psalmist tells us how precious this mercy is. Chapter 36, verse 5 through 7, your mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens. It comes from the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches the clouds. Your righteousness is like great mountains. Your judgments are great, deep. O Lord, you preserve man and beast. How precious is your loving kindness, O God. Therefore, the children of men put their trust under the shadow of your wings. The word mercy in verse 5 is the same exact Hebrew word found in verse 7, translated loving kindness. The exact word, the hesed. So it gives us a clue as to what it means to be merciful. It is loving kindness. It is who God is. What's interesting to me is in verse 6 that he, in this mercy and in this loving kindness, he preserves man and beast. Think about this for just a second. Where I live, it gets cold. It must be why you moved. Because it gets cold. Back in February, there was a couple of days, it was somewhere around minus 21, 22. I think once you get to zero, does it really matter what the negatives are? And it always amazes me. From my house to the church house, I pass cornfields because I live in Indiana and there are cornfields everywhere. And I see out there, here it is in the morning and it's minus 10. And there's deer out there eating in the cornfields. And I thought to myself, they've been out in the woods all night long. God has designed them to live in these conditions. He has preserved these beasts who are not made in His image. They were not the pinnacle or the zenith of His creation. Man was. We bear His image. But look at how He preserves both man and beast. If He's going to do this for the beast, think how much more He'll do that for us. He's merciful. That's why it is to be emulated as followers of God. That's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and verse 7, blessed are the merciful, the ones who are going to look like their Father who is in heaven. Think for a moment about a merciless world. I've heard a lot of talk about the world we live in now and how we've gone off the rails, and it's true. Our culture's a mess, and I understand that, but it's nothing new. In Genesis chapter 4, you might think of Cain and Abel, and certainly we can do that. Among the first that we have is the murder of Cain, or the murder of Abel by Cain, but if you read a little bit further, you can see Lamech. In verse 23 and 24, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech. Listen to my speech. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, Lamech 77-fold. They were going off the rails. They were losing their way, and it just kept getting worse And here's a guy who is speaking to his wives about how merciless and how ruthless and how abrasive he is towards people. When he talks about a man who wounded me, I encourage you, for you who love to do word studies, you're going to see that he just bruised him. And then the second person you see is a young man. I don't think that's by mistake. Perhaps it's a young man because young men make mistakes. But the word there used is talking about just leaving a red mark, a little welt. Maybe you bumped into him. But he's just talking about how aggressive and how merciless he is to those who dare touch him. How he hurts people. Some of the saddest things I've seen this past couple of weeks, just as I was preparing to come down here, and perhaps you've seen them too. News story of there's a woman standing in front of an elevator and a guy comes up behind her and just knocks her out. Doesn't take anything, just hits her to hit her and then walks away. Wasn't very long after that, there was another news story of a man on a subway just kicking an older lady on this subway and then just laughed about it as he got off the subway. Just ruthless, violent, cruel people in the world. We think about people, and it doesn't just have to be violent, but it can be hateful and uncaring, unkind. You think about in 1 Samuel 25, and a man named Nabal, which I found out that his name means to be adult. I asked my wife, what is adult? A stupid person. Stubborn. Certainly he was stubborn, abrasive, and unkind. It was when Samuel died and David felt like he needed to go, and he went to the region of Paran, or Paran, however you want to say that. And he was protecting that area. And it came time for him to, the shearers were there taking care of the sheep, and David sent some young men to go talk to them, see if they could get some food. And he said, tell them that we've been protecting this area and you all haven't lost anything. And Nabal found out about this and he said, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? You see his attitude? Who is this guy? He is nobody to me. And who am I to give up my stuff for this guy? This food and this drink was for my laborers. It's my food. These are my sheep. These are my labor. Sound familiar? Kind of sounds like Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't it? It's my kingdom, my majesty, and what I did. It's self-centeredness, and sent him away. Kind of sounds like 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17, having this world's goods and sending folks away. To which John says, tell me, how do you have the love of God in you when you do things like that? But if we fast forward a little more into time and we come into the Roman world, they're ruled with an iron fist. No mercy. Just imagine, place yourself in Bethlehem. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16, when the order goes out to kill all these babies in Bethlehem. There's no public debate. There's no conversation about this. This is just what's going to happen. They go from house to house, killing babies ruthlessly. Kind of sounds familiar to our day, doesn't it? No doubt you have seen the videos where we have folks in or places of position and power cheering that we're still allowed to not just abort babies, but those who were born alive from botched abortions. Cheering the fact that it's legal now to murder them. Ruthless. We'll think of the Roman world and we think of the crucifixion. Yes, of course, the bittersweet thing. It is bitter because it is my Lord who was on there, taking my sins Yes, I know it was the sins of the world, but I, like Paul, want to think of it as my sins. He took my sins upon His body. He shed His blood for the remission of my sins. It's better that my sins placed Him there, but it's sweet because I have a place called heaven. I get to go home one day where I don't have to see news stories of folks hitting women in front of elevators or kicking ladies in a subway. I don't have to see folks cheering the death, legislation to kill babies. Crucifixion was Rome's way of saying, don't cross us. It was Rome's way of saying, we rule and you will obey. It was also in that Roman world that there was an enormous gap between the haves and the have-nots. Jesus tells a story in Luke 16 of a man who fared sumptuously and he wanted for nothing. And when he left his home, he didn't have to walk downtown. There was a man right outside his gate, covered in sores and needing his help. And he wouldn't help him at all. Right at his doorstep, and wouldn't help. You see, it's into this kind of world of selfishness. It's into this world of greed and hate and violence and brutality that Jesus speaks. My kingdom will not operate this way. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Later tells his disciples in Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 26. He said, you know how the Gentiles like to lord things over them and show their authority, yet it's not going to be so with you. That's not how this is going to work. As a matter of fact, I do believe it was in Luke 9, and he was passing through Samaria, and they said, you want us to call fire out of heaven? You don't understand what spirit you are of. You don't understand what we're trying to do here. So this is the world of what it looks like that is merciless. This is the world in which Jesus speaks that we need to be people of mercy. So how do we manifest that? How are we going to show that? Big into that. I mean, how do you do this? Because I tell you, there's some people who can irritate you. How we're going to do this? I noticed a book called The Rise of Christianity. And in there he suggested there were 4 things that caused Christianity to rise. Number 1, social networking. Now when I read that I thought, what? Social media? What is this? What are you talking about? These were folks in the first century who would go out and they were not ashamed of their faith. Matter of fact, they wore it as a badge of honor. They found these opportunities to speak, whether it was in their homes, whether it was in the community, whether it was in the marketplace. It didn't matter where they were. They spoke about the gospel and their love for Jesus. Now, they didn't live in a world like I lived in. I grew up seeing churches on every street corner. I grew up around folks who knew the name of Jesus. I myself, before I actually became a Christian, I used to wear my little gold crucifix and I said I believed in Jesus and I honestly thought I was saved. I honestly thought I was a member of the body of Christ. How wrong I was. These folks lived around emperor worship. These folks lived around idolatry. These folks lived around these temples where there were temple prostitutes. And these Christians had to go out, and they were very much in the minority. And they went out and they wore it as a badge of honor to say they belonged to Jesus. And they without fear spoke about the love of Christ. They without fear spoke about the need for Christ in other people's lives. They found a need and they spoke Christ. The second thing that caused the rise of Christianity was We can relate to this. It's been spoken of many times already. They had a very strong, uncompromising stance on marriage and family and anti-infanticide. And I just thought that was just abortion, but no, that was infanticide. Killing children. And they drew a line in the sand and said, we will not cross it. It is to be one man and one woman for life. And there is this nuclear family that has a man and a woman and children. And they love those children, and they care for those children, and they nurture those children. And so they took a strong stance, uncompromising stance on marriage and family and not killing your children. Number 3, a biblical love. What do I mean by that? What did he mean by that? It was that each person around them held value. Each person around them was going to be loved regardless of gender, nationality, or past actions, because they were made in God's image. That's why. And that led to number 4, a ministry of compassion, a ministry of mercy. It was noted in this book that there was, in the first century, a lot of fires and earthquakes and riots and disease. And it was noted that these early Christians, instead of running away from the latest plague, they would run to it. When everybody else was running away, they were offering places of shelter and food and clothing and compassion. They stayed when everybody else was running. Again, regardless of who these people were or what they did or what their past actions were. Sound familiar? Sounds like something that Jesus taught us in the so-called Good Samaritan. In Luke chapter 10, I don't know that I've ever actually seen the word good there. Maybe it is. Good Samaritan. Think about what we have here in Luke chapter 10. You are very familiar with the story. There was a man coming down from Jericho, beginning in verse 30. And we see how one human being will treat another human being. Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. It's just a picture of how human beings treat each other. I've already mentioned a couple of those already in our current day and age. But he fell among these thieves, and they publicly humiliated him, stripped him of his clothing. They wounded him, and they left him half dead. They didn't care if he lived or died, because there was no value on life. And then we notice that there was a certain priest who came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. He actually saw him. We opened this up, we talked about how this was to see the misery or sympathize with the misery of another person, followed by an act of compassion or an act of kindness. Here's a priest. This guy belonged to God. I guess he was busy and he needed to get to church. I guess he was too busy. He needed to go to church so he could talk about having mercy on people. Guess he had to go to the synagogue so he could talk about God's mercy, whatever it was. The point of it is that he belongs to God. He's a priest. He sees a man in need. He sees one who is made in the image of God. He sees his need, and he just passed by like he wasn't even there. It didn't matter to him. And then there's a Levite. And when he arrived at that place, he came and he looked and he passed by on the other side. He too. He's a Levite. He belongs to God. He's been in the worship services. He attends the synagogue. He's heard the stories. He knows of God's grace. He knows of God's mercy. He knows of God's love in his own life. And he sees this man. And he walks by. And then Jesus, in verse 33, says, "But a certain Samaritan." It was mentioned yesterday at this hour about who these Samaritans were, how they worshipped incorrectly, how they twisted things around. And that's right. Why does Jesus use these Samaritans, a certain Samaritan? This is going to get under the skin of these priests and Levites. To think that this Samaritan could do anything good or anything right. You know, the Samaritans had no dealings with the Jews. This certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And he saw him, and he had compassion. He was actually doing what he was asked to do. He was actually living the way God wanted them to live. Jesus was pointing this out. I often wonder what it would be like if Jesus would come into one of our assemblies and talk about those who may hold error, like a Mormon. Take their erroneous doctrine into a community, but they're going out like I told them to go. Okay, they don't belong to God, I understand. Here's a Samaritan who doesn't belong to God, and yet he's doing what is right. He's helping a man who is down. He's showing compassion. We're trying to learn a lesson here. He journeyed and he showed this mercy to him. It was going to consume a part of his day. It's going to be terribly inconvenient to him to stop what he was doing, whatever it was, and he had to take care of him. It's going to consume his day. It's going to be costly. There's resources and money involved. We notice in the text. And so he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the next day when he departed, he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." It was going to take his time. It was going to take some effort. It was going to take resources. It was going to take him to take care of this man. I can't help, but I must share a story of my grandmother's little brother. My grandmother's little brother just turned 95. He was the first wave of Omaha Beach on D-Day. It was his job to go build bridges so that they could get supplies and foot soldiers into Normandy. And he was met by heavy, heavy gunfire. He himself, as an engineer, he was just going to build bridges, but had to do what he had to do. Got his gun, and he shot a man, and it affected him to this day. It was my job as a junior in high school to go interview these folks. And it was at this point where he really stopped the interview. Started to cry. He said, "I just did everything my mama taught me not to do. I'm not supposed to hurt people. I'm not supposed to kill people." He went on later, and he went to do his job, but it always concerned him what he had just done. When he was done doing his job, he went back to try and find the man because he was going to bind up his wounds because it was weighing heavily on his mind. This is someone's son. This is someone's grandson. This is someone's family. And something needs to be done. I found that to be an act of mercy and really left me speechless. It shows what it is to have a heart of compassion, a heart of mercy, and what it looks like to extend compassion and mercy regardless of past actions, regardless of who you are and what you've done. Another story that Jesus tells is found in Matthew 18, verses 25 through 35. Another story that we're all very, very familiar with. Well, there was one who owed a great deal of money, and he would never in 5 lifetimes be able to pay it back. When it was demanded that he pay, he begged, please, I can't pay it back. So he was forgiven all of his debt. And he turned right around after being extended all of this great mercy and all this great compassion, turned around and found someone who owed him pennies in comparison. And he himself, who had received all of this compassion and all of this mercy, would not in turn give it or extend it. So, as a result, Jesus taught he was going to lose his soul over it. How many of us consider ourselves disciples of Christ? I do. Coming back to the idea of these two stories, this story of the Good Samaritan. Which one of these was his neighbor? He said, the one that helped the Samaritan. Jesus just simply said, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. If we don't, Jesus is just going to ask, why do you call me Lord and don't do the things that I tell you to do? Mercy. Mercy is how God described himself. And in a world that is filled with such hate and violence and brutality and cruelty, it will be what distinguishes us, is what will set us apart as we let our light and our love shine. Let's go into a world filled with this cruelty and this darkness and show mercy in the same way and degree that God has extended it to us.